Somewhere in England, around 1543, a boy your age is about to take a beating he never earned, for a mistake he never made. On the orders of a king he is forbidden to touch. That unlucky boy is you, and you have just been handed the single strangest job at the Tudor court. The one where your own backside pays for a prince's bad Latin. You belong to him. You were not kidnapped exactly. You were given. Your father is a lord, maybe a baron with a drafty castle, a long name, and rather more pride than gold. One morning, a letter arrives, the royal seal pressed deep into the wax, and inside sits the most flattering thread of your young life. The crown would be delighted to have his lordship's son educated at court, in the household of the prince himself. Read it again and notice what it is not. It is not a question. When Henry, by the grace of God, King of England, asks to borrow your child, the only sane reply is a deep bow and a heartfelt thank you. So off you go, packed onto a horse with a trunk of your finest clothes, waving at a mother who is trying very hard not to weep where the servants can see. You are 7, maybe 8 years old, and the road to court is long and cold, and full of strangers. From here on, you will sleep in palaces most people never glimpse from the outside, eat meat at every meal while the rest of England rations a bad harvest, and wear velvet worth more than a plowman earns in a year. On parchment, you have just won the lottery. You are also not alone. A royal child is raised with a small pack of well-born boys, sometimes called henchmen or companions, chosen to be his classmates, his playmates, and his sparring partners. You are one of them. You will learn to ride with the prince, to shoot with the prince, to bow at the right depth, to the right people, and to keep your mouth shut at the right moments, which is most of them. This arrangement has a polite name and an ugly truth underneath it. You are part student and part hostage, a living guarantee of your family's loyalty, kept comfortable at court so your father stays well behaved at home. Treat the king well and you live in luxury. Cross him, or let your father cross him, and that luxury can curdle fast. But you are 7 years old, so mostly you just miss your mother and try to remember which fork the dukes are watching. There is a catch. With the Tudors, there is always a catch. A real boy lived exactly this. His name was Barnaby Fitzpatrick, the son of an Irish lord, shipped to the English court in 1543 as a kind of human handshake, a breathing promise that his father back in Ireland would behave himself. Barnaby was dropped into the schoolroom of Prince Edward, the king's only legitimate son, and the most precious child in the kingdom. The two boys became inseparable. Where Edward went, Barnaby went. What Edward studied, Barnaby studied. And when Edward got something wrong, somebody had to answer for it. Funny how that works. Nobody hits a god. To understand your job, you first have to understand the boy you serve, and the enormous shadow standing behind him. The prince's father is the most powerful man in England, and he has recently promoted himself to something just shy of a deity. Henry broke with the Pope in Rome, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and printed his own portrait on the front of the official Bible, sitting right under Christ and handing God's word down to a grateful nation. The man did not do subtle, so by the time your horse clatters into the courtyard, the king is no longer simply a fellow in a very expensive hat. He is God's anointed. His body is sacred. His person is untouchable in the most literal sense the law allows. To lift a hand against the king is treated as the very same sin as lifting a hand against the Almighty, and Henry pairs a short temper with a famously sharp axe. By the 1540s, he has already separated a fair-sized crowd of people from their heads, 2 of his own wives included, along with chancellors, old friends, and anyone who picked the wrong side of an argument about God. The court is a beautiful place where the wrong sentence can get you killed, and everyone in it has learned to smile very carefully. Now chase that logic to its mad finish. If the king's body is holy, then the body of his son is holy too, because that son is the next anointed king, the next living link between England and heaven. Henry waited the better part of 20 years for this boy. He buried wives and rewrote the nation's religion partly to get him. The prince is, for all practical purposes, a sacred relic in a tiny velvet doublet, and the most heavily guarded child alive, which hands the men in charge of his education a genuinely ridiculous problem: the birch and the loophole. Here is that problem, in full. Tudor education runs on one fuel, and that fuel is fear. The classroom's favorite tool is the birch rod, a fistful of thin, springy branches that a schoolmaster whips across the bare backside of any boy who fumbles his grammar. Grammar schools across England are basically small prisons where children chant Latin verbs from dawn and pray they do not forget the next one. Some schoolmasters of the age were remembered less for what they taught than for how many strokes they could deliver before breakfast. Nobody thinks this is cruel. Beating a child for a wrong answer is not a scandal. It is just Tuesday. So here is the Tudor's dilemma, and it is a good one. A prince cannot be allowed to grow up lazy and ignorant, because a lazy, ignorant king is a national emergency wearing a crown. He has to learn his Latin, his Greek, his French, and his scripture, and he has to learn them properly, because a king who fumbles tends to get eaten by the men around him. But he also cannot be beaten when he slacks off, because the tutor's hand on that sacred backside is a confession of treason, and treason is how a man ends up shorter by a head. The teacher is well and truly trapped. His student must be disciplined and cannot be touched. And that, dear viewer, is the entire reason you exist. You are the loophole. You are a boy of decent birth, good enough to share the prince's lessons and his playroom, but common enough that nobody important faints if a rod happens to land on you. The prince's body is sacred. Yours, it turns out, is extremely available. The cleanest prison in England. Before we get to the beatings, let us tour your new home, because it is honestly one of the strangest places in Europe. Prince Edward was born at Hampton Court on the 12th of October, 1537. The male heir Henry had spent roughly 20 years and several marriages chasing. The country lost its collective mind. Bells rang in every parish, bonfires were lit in the streets, and 2,000 cannon thundered from the Tower of London. 12 days later, the prince's mother, Jane Seymour, was dead of an infection from the birth, which set the tone nicely. The most wanted baby in England now had no mother and a father, quietly terrified of losing him too. So Henry built his son a fortress disguised as a nursery. The walls, floors, and ceilings of the prince's rooms were scrubbed several times a day. Anything the boy might touch was washed first. Only men ranked knight or higher were allowed near him, and they had to be spotless and healthy, because the moment a servant showed so much as a sniffle, that servant was gone. Serving boys were banned for being clumsy and grubby. Dogs were banned for the same crime. Nobody who had been anywhere near London in plague season got through the door. Edward even had his own private kitchen, so his food never mingled with the germs of the main one. The whole operation cost around £6,500 in its first year, which is something close to £2 million in today's money, spent mostly on keeping one small boy breathing. The nursery had a staff to match. A grand lady governess, Margaret Bryan, ran the household with the seriousness of a general. A dry nurse named Sybil Penn fussed over the prince for years. There was even a dedicated rocking chamber with 4 full-time rockers, whose entire job was to rock the royal cradle in shifts. 4 grown adults, 1 baby. That is the level of attention we are talking about. This is the gilded bubble you move into. It is clean, it is guarded, it is suffocating, and it is about to become your entire world. A day in the schoolroom. Your day starts early, and it starts with God. Prayers first, then straight into the grind. Edward's tutors were not invented for a bedtime story. Dr. Richard Cox handled the basics and the discipline, and Sir John Cheek, a brilliant Cambridge scholar, took over the heavy lifting around 1544. A Frenchman named Jean Belmain drilled the boys in French. Between them, they ran the prince, and you, through Latin, Greek, scripture, philosophy, history, the laws of England, and music, because a future king is expected to do everything and do it gracefully. The room itself is no playground, just hard benches, cold light through tall windows, a table stacked with Latin grammars, and a tutor pacing in front of it with a rod resting close to hand, in case anyone forgets why they are paying attention. You write on slates and paper, you recite out loud, you copy passages until your fingers ache, and you translate the same dead Romans over and over until they march through your dreams. There is little fun and a great deal of repetition. The tutors believe knowledge got hammered in, never coaxed. Lessons are only half of it. A future king has to be polished, so the day also bends toward riding, archery, tennis, music, and the endless art of bowing to exactly the right depth before exactly the right people. You eat well, course after course of roast meat, soft white bread, and watered wine, because starving the prince's table is unthinkable, and you happen to be sitting at it. You sleep near him, you pray near him, you play near him. Your entire life is arranged around staying close to one boy, which is marvelous right up until the morning it becomes your turn to bleed for him. Edward, irritatingly, was good at it. He could read and speak Latin young. He was writing little Latin letters by the age of 7, and he was scratching out essays in Greek as a teenager. You sit beside this walking report card every single day. When he shines, the tutors beam and the room relaxes. When he stumbles, the whole mood shifts, and your stomach drops, because you have already learned exactly what comes next. Cheek and Cox were both reformers and humanists, part of a growing crowd who actually argued that beating children was a rotten way to teach. Years later, another royal tutor, Roger Ascham, wrote a whole book making that very case, sparked by a real dinner argument at Windsor in 1563 about whether boys learn better through love or through fear. A lovely, enlightened debate. None of it does you the slightest bit of good on a bad morning, when the prince has butchered his verbs and somebody in the room has to bleed for it. Bend over, Your Highness. So how does it actually work? How does a beating get transferred from a prince to you? The traditional version runs like this. The prince muddles his lesson, or talks back, or simply cannot be bothered to try. The rod comes out. But it does not come out for him, it comes out for you. You are marched to the front of the room, you bend over, and you take the strokes that were earned by the boy sitting comfortably at his desk. There is no privacy in it, and that is deliberate. He watches. The other boys watch. That is the whole point. He is supposed to watch. On a bad morning it goes something like this. Edward stumbles over a passage of Cicero for the third time. The tutor's patience finally snaps, and every head in the room turns, not to the prince, but to you. You already know your part. You walk to the front, you bend, and you grip your own knees while the rod does its work, counting the strokes in your head and trying hard not to make a sound, because weeping in front of the prince helps nobody. When it is over, you straighten up, you bow, and you walk back to your seat as though nothing happened at all, and Edward, pale and silent at his desk, suddenly rediscovers his Latin. The cruel genius of the system, if it ever truly worked, was that it ran on guilt instead of pain. A prince does not lose much sleep over a tutor's scolding. He has been told since birth that he is special, chosen, half divine, and answerable to no one but God and his father. But make him watch his only real friend get thrashed because of his own laziness, and suddenly the lesson lands somewhere a rod could never reach. The theory was that affection would do the teaching for them. You suffer, he feels terrible, he tries harder next time so you do not get hurt again. Your pain is his homework, and the welts on your skin are his report card. It is a deeply strange arrangement when you say it out loud. Your job is to be so likable that a future king cannot bear to see you in pain, and then to be in pain on a fairly regular schedule. You are part classmate, part best friend, part punching bag, and the better you are at the first two, the harder the third one bites. Get too close, and his every mistake becomes your problem. Stay too distant, and you fail at the one thing that makes the whole arrangement work. It is a tightrope, and you walk it with a sore backside. The loneliest boy in England. Here is the part that sneaks up on you. You and the prince might genuinely become friends. Real ones. Think about Edward's life for a moment. His mother died when he was less than 2 weeks old. His father is a remote, terrifying god king who visits now and then rather than actually parents. He is wrapped in so many layers of protection and protocol that he barely meets another child as an equal. He is the most important boy in England, and very nearly the loneliest. And then there is you, in the room every day, sharing his lessons, his games, and apparently his punishments. Of course he gets attached. You might be the closest thing to a brother he will ever have. The records back this up. Barnaby is described in the sources as Edward's companion and bedfellow, which sounds strange to modern ears but simply meant the two boys were close enough to share quarters and secrets. They were schooled together, raised together, and learned to trust each other in a court where trust was rarer than gold. For a boy king surrounded by adults who all wanted something from him, a friend who wanted nothing but his company was worth more than any title. We know that bond was real because it outlived the schoolroom. When Edward became king at 9, after Henry died in January 1547, he kept Barnaby Fitzpatrick close and made him a gentleman of his privy chamber, one of the trusted few allowed into the king's private rooms. In 1551, he sent Barnaby off to France to polish his education, and the two wrote letters back and forth across the channel. In one of them, the teenage king tells his friend to behave himself and to keep, in his own words, the company of gentlemen, rather than pressing into the company of the ladies there. A 14-year-old monarch, running an entire country, taking time out of his day to tell his maid abroad to quit chasing French girls. That is not a master writing to a servant, that is a friend who worries about you. So your nightmare job comes with a bizarre fringe benefit. The boy whose mistakes cost you skin might also grow into the most powerful friend in the kingdom. Survive the rod, and you get to stand right beside the throne when your friend is king. Then one winter, everything changes, and it changes fast. In January 1547, Henry VIII finally dies. After years of swelling into a sick and dangerous giant of a man, the boy you have shared a schoolroom with is suddenly Edward VI, King of England, at the grand age of 9. Overnight, your playmate is the Lord's anointed for real, and the strange logic that protected him as a prince now protects him with the full weight of a crown. If raising a hand to the heir was unthinkable, raising one to the king is the stuff of nightmares. For you, the change is dizzying. The friend you wrestled and studied and bled beside now sits on a throne, while grown men in furs bow and scrape and fight one another for the right to rule in his name. Because a 9-year-old cannot actually govern, the real power falls to a council of ambitious adults. First his uncle Edward Seymour, then John Dudley, each one circling the boy king and waiting for an opening. Your access to Edward is now the most valuable thing about you. People who never noticed you before suddenly remember your name and your birthday. It is a golden time and a dangerous one. Edward is young, but he is sharp and stubbornly devout, and under him the country lurches further into Protestant reform. New prayer books, stripped altars, and all the rest. Back the wrong faction in his council, and you can drop as fast as you climbed. The very access that makes you valuable also paints a target on your back, because in a child's reign, everyone standing near the child is a piece on somebody else's board. But here is the cruel twist in the tale. All that frantic cleaning, all those banished dogs and washed walls, and Edward still does not make it. He grows into a serious, clever, intensely Protestant young man. And then in 1553, at just 15, he falls ill and dies, most likely of a lung infection. The most protected child in England, the boy a whole kingdom once cheered into the world with 2,000 cannon, is gone before he is old enough to truly rule, and the friend who took his beatings outlives him. That is the gamble of your entire strange career. You bet your skin on a boy, and nobody ever promised that the boy would last. The catch nobody mentions. Now for a little honesty, because you deserve it before you accept the role. We do not actually have solid Tudor paperwork proving any of this happened the way the legend tells it. Nobody wrote whipping boy on Barnaby's contract. The earliest stories of royal whipping boys turn up decades later, and the version that made Barnaby famous comes from a historian writing in 1655, more than 100 years after the fact. The phrase whipping boy itself only shows up in print in the 1640s. The whole idea may even have been kicked off by a stage play from around 1605, which gave Henry VIII's court a whipping boy character and let the notion snowball through sheer repetition. A few serious historians, John Guy among them, suspect the system is mostly a myth. Their best piece of evidence is almost funny. Edward's own tutor, Richard Cox, wrote that he simply beat the prince directly with his staff. If the great untouchable royal heir was getting walloped in person, you do not need a stand-in to take his licks for him. The sacred body rule may have been more grand theory than daily practice, the sort of thing everybody repeats and very few actually enforce. So do you exist or not? The fairest answer is that your world is rock solid and your job title is blurry. The palaces, the sacred king, the brutal schoolrooms, the lonely prince and his noble companions, all of that is true and documented right down to the shilling. Whether the beatings really got handed off to a friend, or whether that is a tidy story later centuries told themselves, historians are still happily arguing about. Either way, you would not have wanted to be the spare boy in that room on a bad day. Some bets you simply do not take, even at very long odds. From the rod to riches, let us assume the legend holds and you played your part beautifully. What do you actually get out of it, besides a sore backside and a lifetime of trust issues? Potentially, everything. The entire point of being raised at the prince's elbow is access, and access in a royal court is the only currency that truly matters. Grow up beside a future king, earn his loyalty, take a few hits in his name, and you have quietly built a friendship with the single most powerful person you will ever meet. When that boy grows into a man with a crown, your patience can pay off in titles, land, and offices that men twice your age would happily commit serious crimes to get their hands on. And that is only the long game. The day-to-day wages are not bad either. You are fed, housed, and dressed at the crown's expense, handed the finest education in the kingdom for nothing, and taught to read 3 or 4 languages in an age when most of England cannot manage one. Whatever happens to your backside, you walk out of that schoolroom with a mind worth a small fortune and a list of friends in high places that other nobles would trade their estates to copy. The shining example is not even a tutor. A boy named William Murray was raised at court as the supposed whipping boy of the future Charles I, decades after Edward's time. Whatever really passed between them as children, Murray cashed it in spectacularly as an adult. He was handed the keys to Ham House, a gorgeous mansion by the Thames you can still wander through today, and in 1643 he was made the Earl of Dysart. From taking another boy's beatings to taking a seat among the nobility, with the country estate to prove it. Not a bad trade, assuming you survive the early performance reviews. Not every story ends in a country house, mind you. Barnaby went home to Ireland, fought rebels, was knighted, inherited his father's title, and then got tangled in the savage politics of his homeland. He ended up in a Dublin prison and died in 1581, a long way from the palaces where he grew up beside a king. The friendship was real, The happy ending was strictly optional. Why you know this story? So why does almost everyone half remember the whipping boy, even while the historians keep raising their eyebrows? Blame the storytellers. In 1881, Mark Twain dropped a whipping boy into The Prince and the Pauper and told his readers, with great confidence, that real kings had used them. A century after that, in 1986, an author named Sid Fleischman wrote a children's novel literally called The Whipping Boy, about a spoiled prince and the commoner who absorbs his beatings. It won a major award and parked the idea firmly in the head of every kid who read it. The myth, true or not, became one of those facts everybody just knows without ever bothering to check. And you can see why it stuck. It is the perfect little nightmare. It takes something every single child understands, the gut-punch unfairness of getting blamed for someone else's mess, and cranks it up to a royal extreme. You are punished, in public, for crimes you did not commit, by people you are forbidden to resist, all to teach a lesson to a boy who will one day rule the world. It is grotesque, it is unforgettable, and it sits right on the bleeding edge of believable, which is exactly why it refuses to die. So that is your life as a royal whipping boy. Velvet on your back and a rod across it. Best friend to a king and scapegoat to his tutors. A boy whose entire worth gets measured in how much a prince loves him, and how much pain that love can spare him. So learn your own Latin twice, as well as he learns his. Smile politely when the dukes are watching, and above all, keep that royal friendship warm, because it is the only suit of armor you are ever going to be issued. Try not to make him laugh too hard during the Greek. Your skin is counting on it.